Dr. Howard Rankin, our dear friend Howard, it is such a pleasure to have you and speak about something that we've spoken about in the past, but I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. And I think a couple of words, we've known Howard for a very long time.
Long time, yes.
And I personally have learned so much from you, and you do it in such a beautiful way, in such a loving way, and you kind of break down very complex subjects into easily digestible, understandable theories that becomes a part and parcel of our life. So I just want you to know that we really appreciate you and are grateful for having you here today.
Well, for transparency, we started working with Howard in 2015 or 16.
Right.
When we were writing our first book. He's an incredible, prolific author and thinker. He was a psychologist for the, I think, am I saying it right? Lady Diana, and I mean, a lot of famous people. And let's just say that. And he helped us organize our first book, just the thought process and everything. We had done the research and all of that stuff, but to organize a book was different than writing all the papers we've done. And he has been an incredible resource to us. I mean, for anybody who wants to know a brilliant brain, I really truly mean that from the heart. We absolutely love Howard for his thinking, for his honesty, for his brilliance. Yeah, and just an incredible human being. And whenever we get into conversation, we really try to get into deep conversation because he has that toolbox that can open up things. This is not fulsome flattery. So this conversation is going to be a joy and one of many, and it's an important one. It's about addiction, and to me, addiction is a continuum of human behavior that has become more available to us, a continuum of human neurochemistry that has become more available to us over the last century or so, and we'll talk about why, and it's become much more prevalent. Just not because of the things that we can get addicted to, and also our lifestyles. And it's an incredibly important thing because I personally think that this pathway of addiction can become quite disastrous for humanity in general. When I go over the statistics here, after we hear from Howard, it's just scary.
Yeah.
But this is a topic that you have interest in as well and have knowledge about. So we wanted to talk to you about this.
Well, first of all, I'm honored to be with you guys. For your listeners to know, Dean Asher and Alex and Sophie aren't just brilliant people. They are loving, wonderful, warm-hearted people who not only have helped me with their research and their understanding, but also when I was having a difficult time, they embraced me, and that meant an enormous amount, their support for me. These amazing people while I was struggling a bit, and they're part of a big recovery for me. So I want to first say that up front. Now let's get to the addiction.
I would love you, Howard.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Right. Perhaps one thing you might want to say, sometimes I mention it on my podcast, which is to the listeners, if you want to silence your amygdala and you haven't already done so, please do so. You okay?
Yes.
Well, actually, I started my career on the addiction research unit at the Institute of Psychiatry in London a long time ago, last millennium. And there, some of that mythology, which I now call it, about addiction still exists, despite the fact that, as you have pointed out and know very well, that in the last 10, 15 years, we have learnt so much about the neural infrastructure of habits. And to me, that has changed my view of what addiction is.
Absolutely. So when you started a few years ago in this, the perspective was very different, you're telling us. And what was the perspective at that point?
Well, the perspective then, and to some extent still exists, I think, amongst people who, don't really, know the science research and behind it. The sense then was, oh, you're addicted, and most of it then was alcohol and drugs, not so much opioids, but alcohol and other drugs. And it was, oh, well, look, this is a terrible behavior, just stop it, right?
Yeah.
And don't do it anymore. Okay, and we're going to help you not do it anymore by supporting you, and that's it. And really, it was addressed to motivation rather than anything else. Now, the problem with that is motivation is necessary, but it is absolutely not sufficient to break down a long-standing habit of any sort, as you know. And so that led to the wrong mindset for people, and still does. I was talking with a young man. I do some coaching for guys who have been addicted to porn. And I spoke to one guy, and he said, oh, I've had a bad week. And I said, well, what happened? He said, well, on Tuesday I slipped, and, I feel really bad about it. And I said, wait a minute. You started this program 3 months ago, right? That's like 90 days ago. This is the first time you've slipped. You've used once in 90 days. Before you came on this program, you used probably 75 out of 90 days. I don't think that's a slip. I think that's progress.
Yeah.
And that mentality of, oh, I failed, is based on a false notion of what it really takes to break down a habit.
I fully agree.
Yeah.
I mean, the blame and guilt that went with this was actually a pathway to further failure, because it would silence the internal and the external conversations necessary to continue the pursuit, to continue the progress path. And I'm also quite heartened by the fact that we've accepted the neurochemistry of the brain. I mean, I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of free will and all of that stuff, but at the minimum, at the hard level of neurochemistry, we do know that there are mechanisms that lead from point A to point B to point C, and we can work on that. And then the motivational component, which is the surface manifestation of that, is, that's fine. We can own it however we want to, but if we accept the mechanisms behind it, that's going to help things much better. And most importantly, it takes away blame and guilt, which are silencing mechanisms for centuries, if not millennia, where we've guilted people internally into silence and into the further path of destruction. And we saw this over and over again. Howard, when we give talks, this, whenever we go somewhere, and we're going now to Australia, we always ask, we want a community conversation, just as a side thing, to find out what's going on in the conversation. And Aisha and I always talk about the fact that leadership and even love is about listening and understanding, right? And so we have to listen to the different communities, and it helps us understand the whole cornucopia, the whole complex manifestation of how people interact and communicate. And everywhere we went, there was, we're talking about Alzheimer's, for example, or stroke, but there was a bunch of people that would come to us about addiction, about and all the spectrum of behaviors that are in the same environment, the same universe as addiction. And so now we've become quite aware that if we can't talk about mental health without understanding addiction, the young men, one of the saddest thing I've ever seen was the utter hopelessness and devastation in the eye of a 19-year-old.
Right.
We're not going to name, but this young man, I mean, a 19-year-old should not be this devastated, this hopeless. And I saw that in his eyes, and he just pulled enough strength to come to this talk of ours. And you feel hopeless because you can't have deep enough conversations in a meeting like that, right?
Right.
But it's important to start the conversation at the point that you did, as always, brilliantly, which is, it's not about blame anymore. It's not about, just get motivated, pull yourself by the bootstrap. Yeah, motivation, or the mechanism of motivation, which is raising awareness and attention, is just the gateway. Then the rest of the stuff. Before we go on, I just wanted to kind of give some statistics. 20.7 million Americans in 2018, 12 and over, suffered from substance abuse.
Wow.
More than 11 million, 12 and over, from alcohol abuse. 8.5 million from both 12 and over from illicit drugs abuse. 2.1 million 12 and over involving alcohol and illicit drugs, 12 and over. 1.7 million adolescents, 12 to 17, had substance abuse disorder. We're talking about alcohol, drugs, all this, about combined 2.6 million. And the numbers just keep going on. And it's not just one addiction, which is substance abuse and alcohol abuse. Now it's opiates and pain medication, which is in the millions. The porn addiction, which is, people think, oh, but that's not a problem. Addiction is the problem. Yes, the substance might kill you earlier or might affect you quicker, might destroy your life quicker, but the act of addiction is the problem. So having said that, I would love to start the conversation by asking you, what is addiction?
To me, at a simplest level, an addiction is a habit during which you have built up, unknowingly to most people, a neural infrastructure in your brain that is responsible for that behavior. And that neural infrastructure is so well rehearsed that it now sort of evades consciousness. It happens without you. And when we are talking about consciousness, this is important. We need to make a distinction in consciousness between awareness, oh, I'm aware something's happening, and agency, I'm actually controlling the action, right? Mm-hmm. Two things really important. Joe Montana, the San Francisco quarterback, said, when I was playing, I wasn't conscious. Now, he didn't mean he was in a coma. He was aware of what was going on, but he had practiced and practiced and practiced so long that the neural infrastructure on the brain was working automatically.
Yeah.
And that's true of any exceptional skill. That's what you've done. You've developed that neural infrastructure that can go on without you. And indeed, the problem comes when you start to think about it. I mean, the one example I like to think of is gymnastics, which is, unbelievably complex. Can you imagine thinking about what you're going to do as you're going to run and do a double somersault? I mean, forget it. It wouldn't work, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So people have to understand the conscious part of it is just a part of it. But a key part of it is what is unconscious to you, this enormous complexity that our mind-body is, and that we create with repetition. And that would be true even if it was some athlete developing an amazing skill or somebody developing a gambling problem or a drinking habit.
Yeah.
And that was what was missing, I think, early on when I was in my career, 30, 40 years ago. That wasn't what it was. It was all, you got to stop. You're stupid if you keep going. Just stop. And we're here to help you. That's not giving the right message, I do not think.
One point that you made, which is beautiful, which is you said that our neural infrastructure changes. That's important for people to know. It's not a paraphenomenon. It's actually the neurostructure has changed now. So in order to get out of that state, it's going to take some time to change the structure. It's not just a momentary thing that comes and goes and you just pull it take it out and put it on the shelf. Now you have to change the very structure of the brain from that addictive state to a more homeostatic state.
And I think that's huge. And I think that's the huge difference. And I really like the metaphor that you've used in the past. I've heard you use it. The neural infrastructure over time with practice becomes like a really tight rope. And we've got to break that rope somehow, right?
Yeah.
So then it becomes, well, how do you break the rope? But that's what has to happen. People need to understand there is an actual, this is not metaphorical, there is an actual real neural infrastructure that has to be broken down for you to make progress with your addiction. Yeah.
Before we go on, I'm going to give you my perspective from the neurochemical perspective. What happens, what we believe to happen in addiction. When people say we don't know much about the brain, well, that's false. We've learned quite a bit about the brain, but still, it's there's a lot to be learned at the three-dimensional level. How the moment-to-moment interaction of these neurotransmitters. But The main neurotransmitter, even there, I'm a little uncomfortable to say one thing, but one of the main drivers of addiction is dopamine. Dopamine is not a molecule of happiness. It's not a molecule of joy. It's a molecule of anticipation, of expectation, of compulsion. I think I've used the right synonyms there. I mean, it pulls you in a direction. It wants to pull you in a direction. It's ironically, that's why it's also the neurotransmitter of motion and movement, those two concepts. Because in order to move from something, you have to be compulsed and have the compulsion to move in a direction. So people think that, okay, so there it brings pleasure. Well, initially, when it is satisfied for the few seconds, of course it varies, for a few seconds, it brings a feeling of joy. It's all the serotonin and all these other pathways and the GABA, which is the inhibitory, all these things work together to give you a moment of joy. In normal state, we are in equilibrium. You have compulsion, impulse, and then there is joy. And if you can sustain it, that's great. And that's a whole different thing that I'm writing on right now, and we're writing on it right now, which is this how to maintain this state of joy. But what happens over time in addiction, there is more of this dopamine drive, overdrive of dopamine, which is continual compulsion, and the period of satisfaction becomes less and less and less, and it's actually after a while it's no longer there, and it's always just compulsion to the next, and then there's an empty space. So you're creating a disequilibrium of this dopamine drive versus the rested, calm, joyous state. So that's from a neuro.
And that also helps understand the link between substance addiction and non-substance addiction.
Yes.
Okay. Way back when I was on the addiction research unit, I actually got a grant to study compulsive gambling, and we looked at that, and compulsive gamblers have withdrawal symptoms. Right? And that's what you're talking about. They don't,
yes.
They're hooked on the neurotransmitter activity that's going on. They're not imbibing anything. And so that's why anything could be an addiction, because if it creates this push and motivation and drive that is repeated and repeated and repeated, you have built a neural structure that has to be taken down. It just has to be pulled apart. And that takes time, and that also runs afoul of the more conventional, just stop it.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up the non-substance addiction as well, because, as a mother of two teens and as an active member in my family and in my community, I do see a lot of families being worried about certain things around us, including technology, which could be good as well. But you say, for example, social media or having, your iPhones on you all the time. There was a time when I wasn't too worried about it, and I was, trying to be very positive about all of this great information being shared with children and families for them to stay connected, for them to stay global and be aware of what's going on in the world. But I think we've come to a point where it's very difficult to keep a filter of what gets to our children. And that is a major concern. And it essentially changes. I've seen it change the culture of a household and a family and a community because of just this deluge of information that is thrown, especially to children.
Right. Absolutely. And again, there's a relevance here because a lot of these activities, certainly, for example, porn, it's an iPhone away or it's your cell phone away from you. And that's a problem a lot of these guys have. I live life without my cell phone, and there all I have to do is just go to the site, and I'm, so that is a problem. I also think, just bringing in something that I think is really critical here about the generation, the younger generation. Sapien Labs, as you know, they do studies on mental health around the world, and their 2021 study, Mental Health Around the World, showed really high levels of stress and distress amongst their youngest group, which is 18 to 24 years old. High levels. And one of the issues there is, and I'd be interested in your view in this, I know there's a little research, but it's not fully established, was that virtual interaction is not the same as real life interaction. And there have been a couple of studies that have suggested that in virtual interaction, the mirror neuron system, which is really critical for developing social skills, really isn't in play. It's not working. Mm-hmm. Right? And if you're a kid spending 8 hours on the phone, that limits your real life interaction, which is what you need to develop the empathy, compassion, understanding, interpretation of a real life conversation. The example I use is, well, can you imagine the difference between watching a plane crash right in front of you or watching it on a video? Mm-hmm. Totally different. Totally different. Yeah. And so, some of the people in Sapien Labs think that, 18-year-olds today who've been so hooked on that have sort of the social skills of like pre-internet 10-year-olds. Because their interpersonal interaction has been so limited and has been replaced by much less instructive and helpful virtual interaction. Again, some of that science is definitely open still to more research. But
no, I kind of agree with that in a sense that we learn experimentation. We learn experimentation and risk taking. And it's at that edge of that risk taking that we actually grow. When you're interacting with the world across a video interface or telephone interface, that whether we like it or not, that risk doesn't exist. When you're talking to somebody in real life, I'm not talking about a risk to life. We're talking about the tension that's raised in potentially making a mistake, potentially saying something wrong, potentially this becoming uncomfortable, and you're still standing there. You don't have to click a button to turn off the phone, that actually helps you grow, push your neural systems to adapt and learn, oh, nothing happened. That's okay. I can do this often. I can have conversations often with people, and that's growth. That growth paradigm that's only comes through when you are experimenting in real life has abated and has reduced significantly. And I think that will have significant consequences, absolutely. Along the same line, so we talked about, and we kind of alluded to this anyway, but I wanted to expand on that a little bit. All addictions are not the same at many different levels, right? I mean, yes, the neurochemistry, we are, dopamine, serotonin, GABA, glutamate, acetylcholine, and so on and so forth, yes. But the mechanisms and how it connects to our limbic system and how it connects to our humanity, how it connects to our social interaction varies to a great extent. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, certainly when you were talking about substance addiction as opposed to non-substance addiction, that changes the equation quite a lot, because now you've got the effect of the substance on you and your brain system. So, clearly there is a difference there. I responded to a request just recently about somebody asking about the difference between substance and non-substance addiction. And that's clearly one of the things. And, one of the issues, well, do you need rehab for a non-substance addiction? Which is an interesting question. Typically rehab, a large part of rehab for substance addiction is to cover the withdrawal period, right?
Yeah.
To manage that. But if you don't have a chemical addiction, not a neurochemical addiction, but a substance addiction, do you really need that? It's an interesting question. I would argue less so. Again, I'm really against binary thinking, but I would argue less so, but that doesn't mean to say it couldn't be valuable of withdrawing somebody from their usual environment and putting them in a much more constructive environment to pull them out, whether they're addicted to an opiate or gambling or porn or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I foresee a problem with that because if we decide to put someone who has a non-chemical addiction, let's say, a particular habit that is disrupting their life, a rehabilitation for that should always have a component of replacing that satisfaction that they get from the non-chemical addiction. For example, if people are addicted to watching their phones, or say, for example, they're scrolling up and down on social media, and they get pleasure about just getting random information at a very high speed, how would you replace that in real life? It has to be, well, it can be something similar, but it has to be something that is connected to their deeper understanding and meaning of life and what gives them joy and purpose. That's a difficult formula, isn't it? Because it's not the same for everyone.
No, it isn't. That's right.
It could be connecting to the right people for one person, or it could be something as high energy as that non-chemical addiction.
Absolutely. And that's another issue that comes up, which is the different levels, the spectrum of the power of temptation in different situations. So some situation might be, it's mildly tempting, and another situation might be, oh my God, that's going to be almost impossible to resist, right? So, all temptation is not the same, clearly.
Yeah.
Even within a subset of addiction, right? So one of the things that I think it is important that I try to get people to do is sort of rank the, what would be easier to manage, what's a little harder, what's a spectrum of difficulty. Because for me, ultimately breaking that neural infrastructure, that habit, whatever you want to call it, comes when you're in that situation and you do not engage. You do something different. For me, that is what breaks it down, right? Now, you have to be careful about that. Saying, well, here's what you're going to do. You're going to confront temptation. You're not going to do it. And that's going to be great. Yeah, but there are levels of that. You don't want to dive in at the worst, highest temptation because you're probably not going to be successful. You're not doing anything. So you can work up a hierarchy. Okay, this is kind of tempting. Okay, can I manage it? Yeah, I can. I do that. And then, slowly build up that ladder till you are beginning to fray that rope so that the behavior now, first of all, becomes much more conscious to you. So you can have a conscious strategy to interrupt that behavior. You do not engage with that cue. And the more you do that, you're breaking down that rope, really.
Yes.
And
one of the things that I think that matters here is that we're to kind of elucidate this direct stimulation versus indirect addiction, or different kinds of addictions. The direct addiction, things like opiates, things like drugs that bind directly to neurotransmitters or neurotransmitter receptors, that's a very different level as far as scale is concerned. When you're talking about addiction, yes, it's the same mechanisms, but the direct level of stimulation is exponentially much higher levels. And that also has implications as far as treatment is concerned. So to me, when you're stimulating neurotransmitters and you're operationalizing or bringing into the mechanism, into the process, the receptors for opiates or other drug addictions, you are now affecting the brain at a much higher scale than indirect addictions. And I think that has implications as far as treatment and therapy as well. Whereas fraying the rope for minor addictions, although that's questionable if there, but is going to be easier or can be done in a more protracted way or in a space that's in a living space. To sever that link with a drug addiction is going to require much more powerful ways, much more isolated ways, because in that case, even minimal amount of that stimulus is going to be so powerful that it's going to reconstruct that whole pathway again. And I visualize this thing. It's like one of those video games. It's a bridge that you're breaking down, but for drug addiction, it is so powerful that as you're breaking it down, it's rebuilding. So in order to break it down, you really have to do a nuclear, destruction or separation or meaningful separation, so it doesn't have time to reconstruct. For other addictions, they're weaker, and you can actually do the deconstructing while you're in this space, in the real life space.
Right.
So it varies. And the other thing is, now I'm not contradicting myself, but I'm just kind of give you, from my perspective, a different view of this. The phone addictions or these TikTok and social media addictions, these companies are brilliant. They know that how to truly get to your affinity. And in fact, to get to your affinities, your addictive affinities so quickly through a visual medium now, not even through a chemical medium, to the point that you become addicted much quicker. Mm-hmm. Because it's a self-correcting mechanism that they have there in those social media. You're selecting what you like,
yes,
and you're doing it at 10-second increments.
Right.
And as you're doing that, you're actually getting yourself closer and closer to that moment of addiction and greater addiction. So they are finding pathways of powerful addiction through a visual medium, not even a chemical medium. And that's a scary part of this.
Absolutely. And really that whole concept of neuromarketing, where people specifically are looking at how the brain works and adapting their marketing strategies accordingly, is very disturbing. Let's put it that way.
It is.
And that again is where tech and the computer and particularly the phones, we're addicted to our phones.
Yeah.
Right? It's really problematic.
It is. And
I think one of the other issues that I'd like to mention, as it engages a good story, is how practitioners try to engage people who have an addiction. Right? I'll tell you, this actually happened when I was working on the addiction research unit. My boss, Professor Ray Hodgson, and I decided we were going to do some new form of treatment, and we sent out a letter to various people who are in the outpatient program, and saying, here's our plan. What do you think of it? And one day, a very well-dressed gentleman came into our office. Looked like a typical London exec. It was like 5:00 one day. He had his suit on and carried a briefcase. And we talked for a bit, and he said, okay, so you think you can treat this, huh? He said, yeah. He pulled out a small bottle of vodka, opened it, drank it, knocked it all back, and said, treat that.
Wow.
Wow.
And, it was brilliant in a way, that here we are, we got to talk about treatment and all this, that's suddenly going to engage people. It doesn't. Yeah. It got to a point where if somebody came to me and said, well, I want to quit smoking, I'd say, well, why the hell do you want to quit smoking? What, where most people would say, oh, well, of course you need to do it because blah, 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 blah. What I think does not matter. I've got to know what motivates them. Right?
Yes.
And there was this case where I was in the addiction research unit. I was focusing on alcohol and drugs, but there was another section on smoking. And there was a guy there who was inveterate. He'd come and he'd try, and he just wouldn't. He just couldn't get it. And so I shared an office with a guy in the smoking unit. We talked about him, and I learned that he was an avid socialist, which in the UK at the time was not particularly unusual. The Labour Party had been in power, but he was very avid. And one day, I happened to run into the store when this was a time where you could get cigarettes out of a machine, and he was pulling these cigarettes out of the machine. And I said, boy, Joe, those capitalist tobacco companies have really got you by that you-know-what.
Yes.
He quit.
Wow. Yes.
It's not about what our motivation is. It's about what his motivation is. And really, habit stacking, it's like trying to connect that to something that is really important to them. And
Their why.
Yeah, their why. Somebody's been doing the same habit for years and years. First of all, they're probably not going to believe they can do it. Secondly, they're not even sure they want to. If you can, you really want to go deeper and engage that and not assume just because you know it's best for them, they know it's best for them, And I think that's another problem. A lot of people who have these behaviors at some level don't believe they can stop. And part of it is there's this myth of, well, once you choose to stop, that's it. And they've tried that and it didn't work, of course. And so then they get into this rather negative, really, mindset. And as you said earlier, good word, they don't have hope or any faith that they really can do this.
So what you spoke to was motivation, the why. And definitely, and beautifully, started with the fact that that's a requirement, but that's not sufficient, So it's critical that has to be there. There has to be a motivation. This is my why, my kids, my future, or in this the gentleman's case, the fact that capitalists had him by the whatever, and so it's critical that we have the why, but again, that's definitely not enough to maintain or even take the process back from the neurochemical prison that we are put on when we become addicted. What's needed next is a mechanism, and the mechanism varies from person to person. Yep. There are the triggers. So identifying the triggers, identifying the source. Where are they getting it from? How are they getting it? How prevalent is it? How accessible it is? Besides the triggers, the source, and all that, and then the rewards, and then the craving prior to all this. I mean, all those things have to be defined for each person and their mechanism. And I also love the concept that if you fail, it's not failure; it's course correction.
Right.
And that idea of failure has been so destructive for so many. And so taking it from motivation to the next point, which is identifying the triggers, the cravings, the behaviors, and all of that. How do you approach that?
Well, I think it's an identification of the cues. What are the cues, the things you just mentioned, that lead typically to wanting to use whatever that is, right? And, that can be boredom, can be stress, could be fatigue, could be any emotion, anger, frustration, just being alone. Everyone's got their own, and those vary between individuals. But each individual needs to know here are the challenges. Here are the cues that bring this on. Now I've got to look. Sorry, yeah.
Before we go on, I wanted to ask you. So that's actually much more complicated. I think this is the part that's most difficult. This is where I'm not a big psychoanalytical psychology person. Freud has had his times, but. And Jung and his archetypes are useful. But in a way, though, those cues are complex. Most of us don't have access to all of the cues. Most of the patients that I've dealt with, they weren't aware of their cues, or at least the complexity of their cues. And I had, in my 5 minutes in the clinic, I don't have time to figure out, the way their mother treated them, or the way their childhood. How do you get access to those cues properly? Because I want to make sure that we go into a little meaningful depth, because a lot of times we say these things, but the cues part is the one that I've had. Ironically, the reward and all that is slightly easier. None of it is easy, but identifying the cues is so difficult.
That's interesting. I have not found it that difficult, but maybe that's because I'm coming at it from a different perspective.
Maybe you're a better psychologist than I am. That's why.
Yeah. And let's not forget Freud was a cocaine addict too. So,
That's right. With the little swabs. Yeah.
Yeah. So we need to be careful about what Freud said. But typically, I will spend time with people saying, okay, give me the situations where you use the most. What is it? And typically, well, again, it varies depending on what sort of addiction you're dealing with, but not uncommonly, it is tied to an emotion. It's, boredom, frustration, anger, loneliness, fatigue, I'm exhausted, and stress particularly, people use that. Yeah, they use those things to get the buzz, to change that emotional feeling from stress. This is the opposite of that, in a way. It feels like that to them. So then I get them to identify that, and then I try to get them to assess, kind of rate the difficulty in managing that. Now, I've learned along the way you have to be careful there. When I was the clinical director down here at the Hilton Head Health Wellness Resort, which is a weight loss and wellness program, we had asked people who came in what their favorite foods were, just for the heck of it. And then one day, we got them in a room, and then we brought out their favorite foods that they had told us. And then the idea was, okay, now here's what I want you to do. I want you to throw it away in the trash can. And, most of them had said, oh, I could do that. That wouldn't be a problem. Really? I mean, some people got really angry. Some people started crying. Some people just couldn't do it. It was really interesting taking sort of a hypothetical situation and turning it into a real one. It's not as easy as you think, even in that controlled situation. So again, you do have to be careful because people's perception and awareness isn't great, but at least you can get some indication there of a level of hierarchy of what is really tempting and what would be more manageable, and that ladder up that way.
Correct.
And then, actually, this was part of my PhD, was actually doing an experiment which you probably could not do today, which was inpatient alcoholics. They were brought into the room for 30 minutes. Some vodka was put in front of them with the instruction, you can drink it if you want, but the idea is not to drink it. And we were measuring, psychological and physiological variables. And, over about 8 sessions doing that, they definitely improved their expectation of their ability to be able to resist it with practice in a very controlled situation. Now, what was really interesting is for some of the group, we did also some visualization of that, where they were visualizing resisting the alcohol. And that group did even better.
Correct.
Because we know visualization is sort of real life practice. So again, it was exposure without use, break down the infrastructure, fray the infrastructure. And of course, the more people do that, the more they actually then develop some faith and hope and belief. Oh, I've done it 5 times in a row now. I should be able to do it, right?
Correct.
Because that was under very controlled circumstances. I'm not recommending that necessarily, but it is about, for me, it is about, and certainly for the non-drug addictions, it is about being in those tempting situations and not using. And what I like to say is every time you do that, you are fraying that neural infrastructure. You're weakening it. You do it enough times, it breaks. You become much more conscious. You're much more in control of it. And you also have a history now of being able to not engage, right? And so for me, that is really, really a critical thing. And working a lot with guys who are addicted to porn, this has been a very helpful structure and framework for them. Again, they still had that old, oh, if I just decide to stop, I should be, No, it's a journey. It's not an event, First month,
Correct.
you might be able to resist 20% of the time. Second month, 40%. By the 6th month, 50%. By the 9th month, 70%. That's awesome. You're making your way there. It's not going to go from, oh, I made a decision to quit and I'm going to quit. It's not going to go there. And if it does, you're probably not that dependent to begin with, would be my argument.
I completely agree. But the one thing though is that when their craving comes on, which is this dopamine drive to reach that objective, and there are different degrees of that. I mean, addiction is and craving of drugs is the ultimate manifestation of that, where to the point that the person is not even conscious of their behavior anymore. They're just drawn almost like robots and zombies towards behavior. And one of the things that the research shows is replacement behavior as well. Some unusual behaviors such as ice bath and things of that nature, which shocks the system and also affects the dopamine, and or running, or doing things that are almost painful, not so much damaging, but physically painful, and they're doing the hard work of running and exercising, or ice bath or something like that. It shocks the dopamine system into recalibrating.
Right.
I don't know. It's fairly new as far as the technology or the techniques being used and different things, but there's some mechanism to this where because they've seen that the dopamine system is engaged, it's realigned. There's a counter to that dopamine as a result of this behavior. So some of the things that people can do is, if they can identify the triggers, then identify counter behaviors that are powerful enough to at least shake up the dopamine drive.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's so critical to do those. That's why they say that a lot of these ultra runners, and I've heard some of the people that they had some addictive personalities, and ultra running and these kind of unbelievable exercise routines is a fight against such an addiction. And addiction doesn't have to be drug addiction. All these addictions. Yeah. And you brought up porn addiction. I'll let you speak about what I just talked about, all these replacement behaviors, but we should definitely get into porn addiction, because I'm quite scared of its consequences. But before we get to that, what do you think about these replacement behaviors?
Yeah, and that's obviously one of the things when I'm working with somebody one-on-one, that's what we're talking about. Okay, when this happens, what can you do? All right, you've got to have a plan to do something. I do think a lot of the time movement is really critical. So, going for a walk or a run or doing something physical, I think is really important. And so that would be one thing. Perhaps putting themselves in an environment where they're now with other people, so it's just difficult to get on the phone, just stop being on their own. Stuff like that, I think is important to have strategies. When this happens, what's your replacement behavior? Because if you're just waiting around, oh, well, I'll have this and I'm going to twiddle my thumb, that's not going to work. You have to have something to go to, because even if you engage something for 5 or 10 minutes, you might have moderated the temptation quite a lot, and it becomes more manageable, right? So you absolutely have to say, here are the risks, here's my plan A, plan B, plan C in this situation. And again, I think one of the things that is, if you had to choose one activity, it would be moving, physically moving.
I agree with you.
I have a question, and this comes from just some conversations with some patients. I used to work in the smoking cessation clinic when I was doing my residency program. So as far as the replacement actions are concerned, what is your understanding of the efficacy of these replacement activities? For example, if you want someone to stop smoking, is it better for them to have a mock cigarette, or instead of that, do something that is not even close to that action? For example, if someone has let's say alcohol addiction, I know that it is very complex. Is it more efficacious to have a mocktail, or just completely get rid of that activity and be in an environment that doesn't resemble anything to the main activity that they're running away from? Which one is better?
Okay, so obviously it depends on the severity of dependence. Somebody is severely dependent, having a mocktail probably is not a great idea, right? And so it depends really on the severity of dependence. For some people, you'd say, well, yeah, you just have a glass of something else that's non-alcoholic. Somebody who's mildly dependent, that might work. I personally would like to get them away from that altogether, again, just to break the connection, the essential cues altogether, and have them nothing to do with it. So that would be what I would prefer. But again, it's complicated because it really does depend on the severity of dependence of the person, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And some people can't have a mocktail.
That's true.
Without
wonder
having alcohol, right?
Right. I wonder if we should, at that moment, I mean, you as a psychologist and working with people like that, do you trust their decision? If they say, for example, I think I'm going to be okay if I hang out with my friends or buddies who are drinking, and I'm just going to hang out and, have a mocktail. Do you think that people are able to sustain that level of tension?
Well, again, I think it really depends on where the person is and what they feel they can manage. But yeah, I mean, that is critical in trying to define the cue, going drinking with, going to the bar with some friends who are also trying to quit drinking, and you all have mocktails. Can you do that? That's one thing. Going bar hopping with heavy drinking friends, can you really manage that? Probably not. Not a good idea to go right now. And again, depending on level of progress, really.
Agreed. That emphasizes the importance of having a meaningful connection with a psychologist, who can work with you on a day-to-day level. It's impossible to do it all by yourself. Yeah.
You can't. It is essential to have some sort of support system, whether that's a professional or a buddy system or whatever it is. You need that support. There's no question about that. You need that support for accountability. You need that support for people telling you, reminding you what your motivation is. You need that so that you can offer support. And, we recognize that when you do something for somebody else, it actually reinforces what you're doing. So that can be helpful. So the role of other people is unquestionably really critical
So true.
in addiction and any behavior, I think,
Absolutely.
Again, just to reemphasize what such an important point you made, Aisha, which is addiction is an extremely complicated situation. You've just your whole neural structures have been reframed, restructured, and kind of homed in towards that addictive behavior. Everything is being driven by that. Mm-hmm. You need a psychologist to help you in that journey, because we will make missed calls. Because of our own addiction, we'll choose the missed calls and go in the wrong direction. And the reason we're having this conversation is not just about the addiction to drugs and opiate, but because addictive behavior is a part and parcel of our human state, especially in a world where we have surplus, in a world where we don't have to survive from moment to moment, so we don't have the problem of overdrive dopamine because of excess. So we have to be aware of this, and in a world where people are manipulating our addictive network, so we have to be
time.
We have to be very aware of that. Right. But for people who have the problem, they definitely need a psychologist to help them with the journey. The reason we're having this conversation, because it has more to do with all our daily activities of how to become addicted to, or to be driven by positive behaviors, to be aware of our dopamine overdrive behaviors, and the fact that these triggered behaviors are pulling me in a given direction, which we might not call it addiction, but it's a compulsion that's not functional for my life versus others that are functional. That awareness helps you engineer your own neurochemistry as opposed to being subject to others or to environmental factors, which we have been for centuries, for millennia. And it's critical that we become aware of that the fact that we have control over this addictive pathway, at least if it hasn't gotten completely out of control. One of them that we wanted to speak about a little more, and we'll probably have another conversation about this separately, is porn addiction, because you were talking about doing some work on this. And I think that the most powerful human behavior, evolution of behavior, which is reproduction and sex, is so easily subject to addiction. And we know this because I was reading this to my kids that 28% of internet searches are for porn.
Wow. That's
I'm
scary.
like, wait a second, I'm looking in the wrong places.
Or maybe you're looking at the
Right places, yes. Yeah. But 28%, I mean, there's no blame here. This is people who have tapped into the intrinsic human behavior, which is the reproduction. And the other one is eating and food. Look at that. I mean, it's food and so they're so easily destructible. And with porn, it's even more destructive because the amount of work you need to do to find a mate. You have to, you were talking about sitting in front of somebody versus across a screen. Imagine finding a mate, getting rejected, you're talking, watching the cues, watching the tensions, learning, and all of this. All of that is gone where you get to the satisfaction without any of the threat.
Yeah.
That's grounds for the greatest addictive problem in America, in the world for that matter.
That's true.
No question.
And its effect on human sexuality, or its effect on marriage, its effect on human interaction, I think it's bewilderingly powerful and destructive, yet we don't talk about it.
Yeah, and especially when you consider that so many men, boys, get into this and addicted to it like at the age of 10 or 11. Virtually all the ones in the group that I work with in elevated recovery, all 10 or 11. There was a guy last week who told me he was 5. He saw his grandfather's Playboy magazine and he started looking at it and he thought it was kind of cool until his grandmother pulled it away from him. But, most of this, and then if you think about that and think about brain development too, and in those years as well, which I'm sure has another issue there, getting hooked into something at the age of 10, oof.
It's and also at the interaction of how sex manifests, because it's not satiated, so you have to push and push because it plateaus, then becomes dysfunctional sexual behavior and all of these other things that come about. I mean, I'm a big believer of being very, very open and for that when I was growing up. You ready for this?
I am.
Yeah, I'm on the liberal side. You know this, Howie. I mean, some of our audience might be shocked by this, but I'm very much on this. I mean, I had to, Sears Magazine was the best I could do, to watch something, or it's now it's ubiquitous. Right. All any child has to do is press a button and it's available to them.
Right.
And then that addictive behavior, because they don't have their frontal lobe fully developed.
Right.
So now they have to keep pushing. So dysfunctional manifestations of sexuality and the interface of sex and aggression, which is power thing and all. I think it's an incredibly destructive phenomenon that we're not addressing, and we must address. And the question I have is, how would we even address? This is not something that you can legislate, or I think society isn't even starting the conversation about legislation. And I'm not a big person about legislating. I want society to fix its own problems. Right. But sometimes when it's this destructive, I'm worried.
Yeah, and you should be. It's a massive business. I mean, it's a massive business. 28% of searches. Absolutely. It's a massive business out there, which definitely needs to be addressed. I mean, there's no question about it. It is absolutely influencing a lot of people, and particularly young kids. I mean, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds.
Yes, and permanently changing their brain structure and their relationships with women.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing that I usually am concerned about. When children, teens, that's a very awkward age to begin with, and everybody's learning how to interact with each other, boys with girls, and human beings with human beings. And with the whole pandemic thing going on, us being on cameras and on screens and virtual life, the children and the teens that have spent a long time on screens, they will definitely have some trouble communicating or
Oh my gosh.
speaking with the opposite gender.
And that's what they say. That's what they say. They're so used to this virtual stuff. And then they see, they're at a party or something and they get so anxious because all of this stuff has been virtual. And they're concerned that they don't know how to do it and they're going to screw up and they're not, the woman's going to, think they're stupid. And this is a very, very common feeling for men who have this porn problem and have had it at such a young age that it has limited their real life interaction. So they really have no real clue as to what to do or how it will be perceived. And so most of them then get very anxious about approaching a person in an appropriate situation, an inappropriate one. And so they're totally lost. And that's not good, And then, of course, it plays into when they do have relationships, this whole issue of trust and should I tell my partner and, all of that.
Intimacy and,
Right. No, I think it definitely is affecting relationship when someone wants to have a relationship with someone else. So of course, I mean, the first thing in any situation is having conversations and having a better understanding of the underlying psychological boundaries and limitations and strengths moving forward. But what can we do as parents and as a society to address this? It's easy to say, oh, don't watch it and put some, lock and key and privacy things, things of that nature. But I mean, as far as awareness is concerned, what are some of the key tactics or troubleshooting that we can do?
Well, I think some of them we've already addressed, but in this particular case, I think it would be actually encouraging more real-life interaction, because this is what this is a substitute for. And as we mentioned earlier, virtual is not the same as real. You're not learning anything, really. So I think it's important to tell people, in an appropriate way, obviously. You're 13 years old and there's a party. Okay, is how you might want to approach somebody you want to talk to, right? And the problem is they get so self-conscious that screws it up because they haven't had any practice doing it. It's correct. As you said, it's totally false pathway, Correct. And so part of that is getting more and more comfortable about dealing with the opposite sex, independent, whatever context that is. The problem is, if you haven't done that, then there's a danger that you sexualize every encounter with a woman, right?
Yeah, correct.
And that's totally inappropriate.
And we want to be inclusive, so whether it's the opposite gender or the same gender, any relationship that people want to have with, or an intimate relationship at least.
So I think that at the individual level, of course, that's how we would, as counselors, as psychologists, as neurologists, we would approach it. But I think the problem is so great. We're talking about addiction, not just porn, but drugs and food. We're seeing the problem of food. No matter how much information is out there, we're getting more and more obese, we're getting more unhealthy because of the addiction component, because we're not addressing. I think what hasn't happened is a more policy and a more broader approach to human neuroscience of addiction. Absolutely. I've never heard any conversation at a more, at the NIH level, at HHS level, at the State Department level, not State Department, at the national level, speaking to the fact that, okay, we know more about addiction now, about human behavior now. And if we don't address it now, the marketing companies, we've seen this with food, they're better than any psychologist in how to manipulate people's behaviors. And we keep saying, but no, it's because of the fault of the carbs. No, it's because of the fault of the fat. No, it's because of the fault. No, it's because we have a system that knows how to manipulate our addictions, our two biggest addictions, sex and food. And if we don't address it at a more global level, not so much restraining it, but understanding it, having conversations with industry and others, what will happen is we'll become a very dysfunctional society because the market economy is going to want to maximize the endpoint of that market, which is sexuality and food and all of that. So we really need to have conversations. Howard, this has been absolutely amazing. This is such a big concept that we need to have many conversations. But it was, I think, a good beginning conversation to have.
Yeah, I know. It was great. Really appreciate you guys, of course. And yeah, there's so much misunderstanding about this problem, at many levels. And you just brought up the big one, which is marketers are using what they know to get people addicted. That's their goal, is to get people addicted in whatever way they can. Get them addicted, they will have their money forever,
Correct.
And that's a big issue. And it certainly, as you rightly say, as far as food is concerned, how that's marketed, how any of these things, how drugs are marketed, right?
Right.
Correct. We saw this in opiate epidemic. Yeah, and we blame the marketing people, but this is part of the system. I mean, but we have to have the conversation to say there are certain things that we have to kind of have conversations about. The fact that their slippery slope will lead to human behaviors that are incredibly destructive, and by saying that people have to, for a long time it was people have to just pull themselves by the bootstraps. So we've given that up. Now we say that, okay, it's not that, but we have to approach people at the individual level. It's not at that level. If we don't approach it more globally, no single individual will be able to overcome the power of the market to meet our needs of addiction.
They won't. And this notion is people can decide for themselves. They know what's good for them. It's total justification and rationalization. That's total.
Exactly.
And we know.
I
everyone
agree.
knows it. Everyone knows it. I mean, I've, particularly the psychiatric meds, I think are problematic. I haven't done it yet, but I've always wanted to make an ad where when the side effects are mentioned, instead of seeing smiling faces and people going, you actually show the side effects, people dropping dead or throwing up or what have you, to give a more realistic view, or being, hooked on them 20 years later because they can't get off them. A more realistic view of what's going on. But this is all the advertising is to pull you in and get you hooked.
Exactly.
Here's to more complex conversations. Here's to more interaction, human interaction. Here's to more psychologists being a very important part of our society and go hand in hand with whether it's medical treatments or lifestyle treatment, whatever it is. I think everything starts with mental health and it ends with mental health. And we have to make sure that is a critical component of any program that focuses on well-being and wellness in general. Well, thank you so much, Howard, for your time. We really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll have many conversations in the future.
Awesome. Thank you.